Thank you, Laura, and thank you for everything you've done this past year for RSA. I think I'm as grateful as everyone else. So you'll note the title of my talk today is Changing the Conversation Around Alcohol, and this has been the title of my talk all spring and early summer. And I think there's some lessons here about how we approach our research as well as how we approach alcohol in our culture, and we'll talk about that. But before I get into that part of the talk, I want to acknowledge the passing of three scientists with whom I actually had personal relationships and respected greatly. So Dr. George Koob was a long-time faculty member in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco, and the San Francisco VA Medical Center, and then president of Neurobehavioral Research Incorporated. He advanced our understanding of the impacts of aging, alcohol, and other substance use disorders and psychiatric disorders on brain structure and function. He made the pivotal finding that treatment for and recovery from alcohol use disorder are associated with compensatory functional network alterations in the brain. Dr. John Littleton was a longtime professor at the University of Kentucky and the co-founder of Naprogenics. His groundbreaking research contributed to our understanding of the molecular actions of alcohol, including high-throughput pharmacological screening for compounds that demonstrated preclinical efficacy in reducing alcohol effects on the central nervous system. Dr. Littleton played a key role in exploring the mechanism of action of acamprosate that led to its approval by the FDA as a treatment for alcohol use disorder. And Dr. Enoch Gordis, former director of NIAAA from 1986 to 2001, Dr. Gordis emphasized science as a way of understanding alcohol use disorder. Trained in internal medicine, he conducted research in the laboratory of Dr. Solomon Burson and Nobel laureate Dr. Rosalind Yalow during his residency at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. Subsequently, he worked with Dr. Vincent P. Dole's research laboratory at New York's Rockefeller University, where he began his career in the study of addiction. He later worked with psychiatric researcher Dr. Ruth Fox, who helped introduce disulfiram into the United States as a medication to treat alcohol problems. So believe it or not, Enoch Gordis contributed to the discovery of methadone and its use in the clinic, and the use of disulfiram, or anti-abuse, in the clinic. In 1971, Dr. Gordis founded and directed a new alcohol treatment program at Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, New York. He remained there until his appointment to NIAAA. At NIAAA, Dr. Gordis is remembered as a visionary leader. During his tenure as director, he oversaw the launch of several innovative research initiatives, including the collaborative study on the genetics of alcoholism, the National Longitudinal Alcohol Epidemiological Survey, the Integrative Neuroscience Initiative on Alcoholism, and the Combined Pharmacotherapies and Behavioral Interventions Clinical Study. Dr. Gordis' leadership was embodied by his love of science, his compassion as a clinician, and his demeanor as a gentleman. He inspired many and left a lasting impact on NIAAA, NIH, and the alcohol research field. I remember Enoch very fondly. He welcomed me to NIH when I joined as director. We had a lot of great discussions, and I remember very poignantly that when you spoke with Enoch, you had his full attention, and he had this piercing way of asking questions that got right to the heart of the matter. And so I really miss Enoch. So some staff announcements and budget, some issues that I think are important knowledge that we'd like to share with you. So first of all, Dr. Lovinger is now NIAAA's new scientific director for the Division of Intramural and Clinical and Biological Research. He provides scientific program and administrative leadership. He is also responsible for promoting an inclusive environment that values diverse perspectives, encourages collaboration, and facilitates innovative research. Many of you know he's a world-class neuroscientist with his own laboratory. He studies neuroadaptations associated with alcohol, particularly in pathological habits, and issues surrounding memory. Dr. Lovinger was previously NIAAA's acting scientific director. And Ms. Dawn Wayman is NIAAA's scientific diversity officer, and she is helping to catalyze and coordinate NIAAA specific goals and resolve critical issues that will enhance the diversity and equity of research programs. Ms. Wayman was previously the branch director for strategic diversity and inclusion in NIH's Office of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion. And we're really, really excited to have Dawn join us and help us with our program on diversity, equity, inclusion. You always want to know about the budget. Well, the budget this year was very good. I think you can see a steady increase in the budget since my tenure began as director of NIAAA. I'd like to take credit for that, but the truth of the matter is the credit is due to Francis Collins and Larry Tabak, who have been really had a wonderful relationship with Congress, and I think if you really want to know, that's where all of NIH has benefited, and I think it's really wonderful that we've been able to sustain such increases. I cannot make a prediction for the future, however. As far as success rates go, we're doing pretty well at NIAAA. We're hovering, as we usually do, around the 20th percentile. I want to point out to you something I point out every year and have done for 10 years now, which is you do better submitting an R01 than you do submitting an R21, but that doesn't stop everyone from submitting R21s. Remember, under my tenure, an R21 at NIAAA is a grant to generate data for an R01. It's not a bridge to retirement. And I further want to emphasize that you'll see this swing in the percent of success, and I think you have to take the long view, because when we have a year like 2018, where we had quite a big increase in budget, then there's a tail to that because of what we call churn in the business. So that means that we're paying for those grants for 5 years after we funded them. So you see this kind of fluctuation. But I want to emphasize again that for the most part, we've been at around the 20th percentile, which across NIH is pretty good. So here's what I really want to talk about today, and that's our efforts to change the conversation around alcohol. So I'm going to talk about raising the awareness about the scope of the problem. I'm going to talk about embracing the changing culture around alcohol in society, advancing screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment, which we fondly call SBIRT, as part of routine healthcare, assessing and implementing the Addictions Neuroclinical Assessment Framework, which we consider a window on individualized etiology, prevention, and treatment, enhancing recovery research, integrating alcohol use disorder treatments for comorbidities, and we're going to specifically focus on hepatologists leading the way, combating stigma, advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in alcohol research, and disseminating NIAAA resources. If I leave out one of your domains, it's not on purpose. It's just simply that I wanted to emphasize broadly what we're doing at NIAAA to change the conversation about alcohol. So let's talk about the scope of the problem. I'm going to go relatively quickly through this, and I'll explain why. First of all, with the DSM-5 being used by NISDA, the estimates now are that there are almost 30 million individuals with alcohol use disorder in the United States, and you know alcohol use disorder is a spectrum disorder from mild to moderate to severe, and that's probably one of the reasons for the increase in their metric. But you know, there's also 140,000 alcohol or alcohol-related deaths per year in the United States, and in just an unbelievable number of emergency department visits. You know, I always say that if you go into any major medical center, hospital in the United States on a Friday or Saturday night, half the people there are because of alcohol. So the reason I'm going to go fast through some of these statistics is you can now find them, and that's what's written in this box here, as in Alcohol Facts and Statistics Information Resource on our webpage. So you can find it in the Alcohol Effects on Health section of NIAAA's website. We're going to continually update this facts and statistics part, if you find any errors, please let us know, but you should be able to go to this section and find these statistics. So please don't go into the archives and report data from 20 years ago. Try and be up to date and hip with NIAAA's latest facts. But a little more sobering is that we now know that during the pandemic, there was a dramatic increase in deaths associated with alcohol. These are death certificates that actually listed alcohol as the primary care cause of death. There was a 25% increase in 2020 compared to 2019. Just to remind you, the pandemic, we officially argue, started at early 2020. It went up even further in 2021, a 35% increase. And in 2022, as you can see, it hasn't gone down that dramatically. It's still at about 25% increase. And based on what we know about Hurricane Katrina and what we know about 9/11, there's going to be a tail to this pathology that's been caused by alcohol. And it's more extensive than that. There's been an increase in a variety of alcohol-related harms during the pandemic, increase in the percentage of emergency department visits that involve acute, excessive alcohol consumption, increase in the incidence of alcohol withdrawal in hospitalized patients, increase in deaths from alcohol-associated liver disease that was bigger than increases in prior years, even a 14% increase in alcohol-impaired driving fatalities. This graph here shows the increase in hospitalization for alcohol-associated hepatitis, one of the more severe forms of alcohol-associated liver disease, between 2019 and 2020. This was particularly evident in this particular study, which was done in Fresno, California, at 3 community hospitals. And what is being shown in the graph are monthly incidents of alcohol-associated hepatitis. And you can see it's about a 51% increase from 2019 to 2020, causing hepatologists to actually argue that we're in the midst of an epidemic of alcohol-associated liver disease. And I don't have to convince this group, and I think this affects just about everyone who works on some aspect of alcohol at RSA, but alcohol affects more than 200 diseases and injury-related conditions. You know, most of us focus and think about the liver, but I want you to realize that in collaboration with the National Cancer Institute and some of their really important work, they now have epidemiological data that indicate that alcohol is responsible for 5 to 6% of cancer. 5 to 6% of cancer. You're right up there with tobacco and obesity as one of the major causes of cancer in the United States. And then another issue that we think is quite important and bears an important amount of work, and I know that many of you are engaged in this, but it has to do with male and female drinking patterns are converging. While we've seen a decline in underage drinking, and we're very proud of that and very happy about that, and we hope to be able to see that continue, as you can see in the graph on the right-hand side, but alcohol use is decreasing, but faster for males than females. And you can see that now females are drinking almost as much as males, or more than males. In college-age populations, we see females binge drinking more than males, and alcohol use in the last 30 days more than males for the first time ever. And young adults, alcohol use is increasing, but faster for females than males. In middle-aged adults, alcohol use is increasing for females and not for males. And for older adults, my generation, alcohol use is increasing more in females than in males. And you can see, again, in both graphs, this convergence. And why is this important? Well, studies suggest that women are more likely than men to experience a variety of alcohol-related harms at comparable doses. These range from hangovers and blackouts and liver disease, all the way to a faster progression of alcohol use disorder, certain cancers, and larger increases in alcohol-related emergency department visits, hospitalizations, and death for women over the past 20 years. And then if you look on the right-hand side of this slide, women are less likely than men to receive alcohol use disorder treatment. And even in neuroscience, if we looked at a couple of years ago at 230 structural neuroimaging studies on substance use over 23 years and looked for evaluation of sex differences, and only 26% of these studies actually reported the female data and separate from the male data. They all included males and females, but they didn't analyze the data, or if they did analyze the data, they didn't report it. And even if it was comparable, we would like to see the report. And more research is obviously needed to better understand sex differences in alcohol use and consequences, and those in the preclinical area know very well that we're well underway with that now. But I might admit that, you know, I'm as guilty as anyone. For 50 years in my laboratory, we largely studied male rats. That's not the case anymore. All right, we also have concerns about alcohol use for adults age 65 and older. First of all, alcohol affects behavior and health differently as we age. The health consequences of alcohol tend to shift from acute causes, which are injuries, to chronic causes, cancer, heart disease with age. Older adults are more sensitive to the sedative effects of alcohol, as well as to the effects of alcohol in reaction time, balance, attention, and driving skills. Older adults experience reductions in body weight and body water, which means for the same amount of alcohol ingested, you get a higher blood alcohol level. They take more medications that may interact with alcohol. 2 + 2 = 5 when you're talking about sedative hypnotics and opioids, and the older population are more likely to be engaged in medications, especially to help them sleep, because sleep gets disrupted as you get older. They have an increased risk of injury from falls. This is compounded by alcohol. I always say that males should never climb a ladder after they're 50 years old. Definitely shouldn't be climbing a ladder after 50 years old and drinking alcohol at the same time. They have an increase, both alcohol and aging involves a widespread inflammation that can contribute to cardiovascular disease and cancer, and also disrupt sleep, as I mentioned. There are, I think, 3 symposia at RSA on alcohol and aging. I'm discussed in one of them, and so I think this is an important topic that is emerging and continues to emerge. And then alcohol and mental health are intertwined. Alcohol use disorder is highly comorbid with mental health conditions and disorders. The prevalence of alcohol use disorder among people with anxiety and mood disorders ranges from 20 to 40%. Between 30 and 60% of people who seek alcohol use disorder treatment have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Alcohol misuse often precedes diagnoses of mental health conditions, and is a window on other medical conditions as well. And alcohol misuse is commonly used to cope with symptoms of mental illness. The COVID-19 pandemic worsened already declining mental health, and 1/4 of the US population increased drinking during the pandemic. In the end, alcohol misuse makes prognosis worse for mental health conditions, and it makes complicates the treatment for alcohol use disorder. I was just at the College on Problems of Drug Dependence briefly, and we had a symposium on the comorbidity of alcohol and mental health conditions and why we don't include mental health conditions in some of our clinical trials. That's another topic that we'll be raising at NIAAA this coming year. Alcohol, pain, and opioids are intertwined. The opioid crisis overlaps with other public health challenges such as undertreated chronic pain, mental illness, and alcohol use disorder. Alcohol misuse contributes both to physical and emotional pain, and pain contributes to alcohol misuse through drinking to cope. There are overlapping brain mechanisms in chronic pain, alcohol use disorder, and opioid use disorder. A detailed understanding of this relationship provides an opportunity for preventing and treating those problems. Alcohol has been listed as in 1 out of 6 drug overdose deaths in 2020 and 2021. That's 16%. And remember, I said 2 + 2 = 5 when it comes to that pathological interaction. Addressing alcohol misuse in individuals with chronic pain and opioid use disorder may help improve patient outcomes. This is a picture of me actually participating with Larry Tabak, the acting director of NIH, Dr. Nora Volkoff, the director of NIDA, at a RX summit on this exact issue. And this cartoon says, "I don't prescribe opioids anymore, so have your bartender fill this prescription." The point here is that in a meta-analysis of 18 studies, the mean blood alcohol content of around the binge level, 0.08 gram percent, produced a small elevation in pain threshold and significant reduction in pain intensity. Higher blood alcohol levels equals lower pain sensitivity. And this could explain why people in chronic pain often misuse alcohol despite consequences to health. And we're picking this up from individual small studies of pain from pain docs and anesthesiologists that people are actually misusing alcohol as restrictions emerged over opioid use. So, what about embracing the changing culture around alcohol in society? We've been big supporters of what we call the Sober Curious movement, and we think this highlights a cultural shift. This can include things like Dry January, Sober October. I think between Aaron White and I, we did some prodigious number of interviews during our Dry January press marathon, and I was quoted there as in the following: Dry January helps us evaluate our relationship with alcohol. If you stop drinking in the month of January and suddenly you feel better, then your body is trying to tell you something, so listen to your body. And maybe Jennifer Garner said it worked better than I. She says she's cutting back on alcohol. The older I get, the more I want to protect my brain. I can identify with that. What about alcohol-free options? They're becoming more available. This is another sign that there's a shift going on. Mocktails, dry bars, alcohol-free drinks are being offered at regular bars. And so, the take-home message from this slide is the following. We should never have parties where alcohol is served where there's not a non-alcohol containing beverage option. Think about that, and think about that at how it would affect society if we insisted or made a big deal of the fact that if you're holding a party and serving alcohol, that you also serve beverages that don't contain alcohol, giving people the option. This cultural shift provides opportunities for prevention. We're supporting a broad research portfolio on interventions to prevent and reduce alcohol misuse and related harms across the lifespan, such as alcohol screening and brief intervention, other interventions at the individual level, family, school, and community interventions, policy research. Yes, we do policy research. Research, we don't set policy, we do research, right? NIAAA is also interested in emerging areas such as how social determinants of health interact with biological and behavioral pathways to contribute to alcohol health disparities, the influence of social media and other digital technologies on alcohol use and related consequences, including how social media can be used to prevent and reduce alcohol misuse, as opposed to the converse, and how to enhance the scalability of effective prevention interventions for women and other groups. This brings me to SBIRT. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because most of you are familiar with this. So this is alcohol screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force recommends alcohol screening and brief intervention or counseling in primary care settings for adults age 18 and older. A growing body of evidence indicates that alcohol screening and brief intervention is also effective among adolescents, research that we've supported at NIAAA. We are promoting the use of screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment as part of routine health care. Screening for alcohol misuse can also help clinicians spot other physical and mental health related issues, as I mentioned before. And some factoids: adults who binge drink are more likely than drinkers who do not binge to report past year suicidal ideation, report episodes of major depression, and report prescription pain medication misuse. And this slide by a study that was led by Carrie Mintz is really telling, because it shows that 70% of individuals are screened in this particular study, but then when you go to brief intervention, it plummets to 12%, and when you go to referral to treatment, it plummets even further to 5%. And in the US, women appear to have lower odds of receiving brief intervention for unhealthy alcohol use across all ages, particularly during middle age. Black women and Latina, Hispanic women appear to be less likely to receive brief intervention than women in other race ethnicity groups. So, these data, which are really compelling, show that screening, but little advice or referral to treatment are offered to people with alcohol use disorder. This is my ode to neuroscience, and you neuroscientists are going to find it a little odd that I take this tack, but I want to emphasize that neuroscience in some ways has indirectly contributed to a broader perspective than some of you may realize. So this is assessing and implementing the Addiction Neuroclinical Assessment Framework, a window on individualized etiology, prevention, and treatment. So you all know the Koob cycle on addiction, the 3 stages, the 3 domains of dysfunction, and the 3 circuits or Uber circuits that are thought to mediate these 3 stages. I'm not going to go through them in great detail. Binge intoxication stage, incentive salience, pathological habits is the domain of dysfunction, basal ganglia is the mediator. Withdrawal negative affect stage, reward deficit, stress circuit, it is the domain of dysfunction, extended amygdala as the mediator. And then the preoccupation, anticipation, or craving stage, executive function deficits as the domain of dysfunction, and largely frontal cortex or old cortex, allocortex as the mediator. This was originally a spiral, and when it was originally conceived in the paper I wrote with Michel Lemoyle in 1997. But I went to this RSA meeting, or maybe it was Society for Neuroscience, I can't remember which, but somebody had mounted my spiral on a toilet. And after that, Barbara Mason said to me, well, you got to change it into a circle. So that's where the circle came from. So speaking of the circle, Laura Quacco, who is now the director of our branch of health services in the Division of Treatment and Recovery Research, was working in the intramural program with whom she still certainly collaborates on a couple of levels. But we came up with the idea of what we call the Addictions Neuroclinical Assessment Framework. And it's a framework for improved diagnosis, prevention, and treatment. And the idea was that we wanted to identify how the 3 domains of dysfunction that we hypothesized exist influence differences between people diagnosed with alcohol use disorder, which can then be used to guide treatment decisions and to better understand the differences between individuals with and without alcohol use disorder. And I might mention that Riza Monoman, Ray Litton, and David Goldman were key parts of this original study. And so we thought that if you use scales or self-report measures and a variety of, ultimately we were dreaming of maybe even imaging measures, but also neuropsychological tests that represent dysfunction in these domains, that we might be able to parse out better diagnosis and better precision medicine for treatment. That was the hypothesis. Well, we had a meeting with NIAAA about this that included Carlos Blanco and Nora Volkov, and they were writing a protocol. Laura was writing a protocol with Vijay Ramchandani and David Glassman and Nancy Diaz-Granados on doing this exact kind of study in the clinical center. But Nora said, well, why are you going to wait for the protocol to be approved? It has now been approved and the studies are ongoing. And she said, why don't you just look at the patients that are already passed through the clinical center? So in a large, diverse clinical sample representing the spectrum of alcohol use disorder, the 3 neurobiological domains hypothesized to be critical to the addiction cycle, incentive salience, negative emotionality, and executive function, were identified through factor analysis. Measures of addiction, personality, cognition, behavior, and exposure to early life stress were collected in 454 patients. The study confirmed the relevance of the 3 neurofunctional domains to alcohol use disorder, and using a mimic approach, multiple indicators, multiple causes, early life stress and socio-demographic predictors were identified. Well, I'm kind of proud to say that there's now been a whole herd of studies, some done by Laura Ray, many others here in the audience, Katie Witkowitz's group, that have basically validated the 3 domain approach. So I'm just going to go through this very quickly. There are 2 slides of addition and validation, but I just wanted to show you the power of the evidence at this point. So 3 factors, executive function, incentive salience, and emotionality, were all associated with current AUD in heavy drinkers. Significant predictors included history of alcohol use disorder, positive family history of alcohol dependence, earlier age of first drink, and history of childhood emotional abuse and physical neglect, a study by DiMartini et al. Among problem drinkers, 4 core constructs were identified: incentive salience, negative emotionality, executive function, and negative alcohol-related consequences, Nito et al. In non-treatment seekers, deep phenotyping combined with factor analytic techniques implicated 3 intercorrelated neurofunctional domains that mapped onto the proposed ANA domains with methamphetamine use. That was a paper that you did. In individuals who were undergoing functional MRI after exposure to alcohol cues and negative cues, functional changes in the nucleus accumbens and amygdala were associated with incentive salience and negative emotionality domains, Al-Kahili et al. And among treatment seekers with AUD, the incentive salience domain showed construct validity and greater predictive validity for drinking outcomes compared to pre-existing scales. And the negative emotion, and that was a study by Stein et al. And then a negative emotionality domain showed construct validity and demonstrated current associations with more frequent and heavier drinking and drinking to regulate negative affect. Vote to alcohol. So I'm going to dovetail this into enhancing recovery research and changing the conversation around recovery. So little is known about what sustains long-term recovery. If you go to a place like Betty Ford or one of a 28-day rehabilitation facility that uses everything from motivational and interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapy, sends people to AA, also does cognitive behavioral therapy, I said that, maybe does neuro feedback or biofeedback and yoga. You don't know 12 months out or 3 years out what worked to sustain recovery. It could have been the yoga, all right? So to address limitations associated with prior alcohol use disorder recovery definitions and lay the groundwork for future recovery-related research, we defined recovery from alcohol use disorder based on qualitative feedback from key recovery stakeholders, researchers, clinicians, and recovery specialists. The new definition defines recovery as both a process of behavioral change and an outcome that incorporates time periods for remission from DSM-5 AUD and cessation from heavy drinking, a non-abstinent recovery outcome. Some of you would argue a harm reduction outcome. The NIAAA definition of recovery also emphasizes the importance of biopsychosocial functioning and quality of life in enhancing recovery outcomes. I presented this at CPDD last week, and I had presented it the year before, but for some reason, they only read the slide this year, but they went nuts over the fact that we were actually proposing a harm reduction definition for research on recovery. And speaking of the value of the three domain dimensions of the addiction cycle, but also of studying recovery, there's a really nice study by Katie Witkowitz's group that I like to highlight. It basically shows that greater relief negative emotionality at baseline in individuals predicted greater drinking intensity and more frequent heavy drinking during recovery. So they used measures from Project Match and Combine, which are 2 of the largest studies ever done and funded by NIAAA. And the results of the study supported the utility of the domains of the 3-stage addiction cycle in predicting alcohol use disorder treatment outcomes and recovery 1 year post-treatment. The study validated the 3 domains of the 3-stage addiction cycle. And at 1 year follow-up, relief negative emotion scores were associated with drinks per day and percent heavy drinking days, as I said earlier. What you see here in the slide highlighted is the beta coefficient, which is the degree of change in the outcome variable for every unit change in the predictor variable. And even more compelling, from my perspective, is lower relief negative emotionality predicted high functioning, infrequent drinking during recovery. So they further analyzed the data with 4 latent recovery profiles reflecting different levels of drinking and functioning that were derived based on indicators of alcohol use. Addiction cycle domains were used to predict membership in the high functioning, infrequent drinking profile versus the non-recovery profile. And again, it was low relief, negative emotionality. So just the converse of the previous slide. So low relief, negative emotionality predicted membership in the high functioning, infrequent drinking profile versus the non-recovery profile. So if you put all this together, and I'm going to quote directly from Katie's paper, this kind of approach could potentially inform precision medicine approach to AUD treatment. It could inform testing, whether domains are equivalent across socio-demographic groups, and it could demonstrate their association with clinical outcome. So one of the questions I think I got asked in the question and answer period is, how does neuroscience contribute to what we need to know about the changing culture of alcohol? And I'm changing the question a little bit. And I think understanding these circuits, understanding sub-circuits will, and how they fit into these domains and subdomains is a critical way that we can translate neuroscience into action. So what about integrating alcohol use disorder treatments for comorbidities? Hepatologists are leading the way. I'm gonna have to move with vigor because I see the time. Alcohol misuse accounts for nearly half of liver disease deaths each year. Alcohol-associated liver disease is the most common alcohol-related cause of death and the leading cause of liver transplantation. Alcohol-related deaths increased 47% between 2000 and 2019. The rates are increasing faster for women and among young adults. We envision a paradigm shift, and you can see that in the graph here, where deaths associated with alcohol-associated liver disease are now surpassing those of non-alcohol-associated liver disease deaths. So we envision a paradigm shift. Integrated treatment for alcohol-associated liver disease and alcohol use disorder can improve patient outcomes. Treating alcohol use disorder with medication reduces the likelihood of developing alcohol-associated liver disease and the progression of existing alcohol-associated liver disease. And behavioral pharmacotherapy for alcohol use disorder after discharge from hospitalization for alcohol-associated liver disease reduces readmission and death. And why is this important? Well, it's particularly important because now there's really a huge surge in liver transplants for individuals with alcohol-associated liver disease, even young people in their 30s. Currently, many US transplant centers typically require a 6-month period of alcohol abstinence prior to liver transplantation. Yet it's not realistic in severe alcohol-associated hepatitis, where a majority of patients occur within 2 months of diagnosis. Data suggests that patients who receive a liver transplant without the 6-month period of waiting, this is called early liver transplant, have similar survival outcomes and alcohol relapse rates as patients who receive a transplant after a 6-month waiting period. So we actually recently issued a request for applications to encourage studies about this issue. Combating stigma, I only have one slide on this. Words do matter. We published a paper with I published a paper with Nora Volkoff and Josh Gordon, the head of NIAAA, on this. We can help alleviate stigma associated with alcohol-related conditions by consistently using non-pejorative, non-stigmatizing language to describe these concerns and the people who are affected by them. Some words are commonly used in society, such as alcoholic and alcohol abuse, are stigmatizing. So listed here, alcohol use disorder, use that instead of alcohol abuse and alcohol dependence and alcoholism. Use alcohol misuse instead of alcohol abuse. Use first-person language to describe people with alcohol-related problems. Person with an alcohol use disorder, person in recovery. And use alcohol-associated liver disease instead of alcoholic liver disease. And use alcohol-containing beverage instead of alcoholic beverage. Advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in alcohol research. This is a big area for us. It's one of our major cross-cutting themes in our strategic plan that we're working on. We fully support and are committed to the NIH Unite initiative, a coordinated effort to address structural racism and promote racial equity and inclusion at NIH and within the larger biomedical research enterprise. We're focusing on 3 primary areas to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion: workplace and culture, workforce, and research portfolio. There's a herd of recent NIAAA supported opportunities to enhance diversity in alcohol research enterprise. I'm not going to go through all these, but It ranged from a plan for enhancing diverse perspectives in our centers program to a number of training programs that are focused on encouraging individuals from diverse cultures and environments to apply and work and be trained in the alcohol field. And I want you to know that the BRAIN Initiative, particularly those of you who are neuroscientists, has really been moving forward with great vigor on these diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and we follow right behind them. So whatever they do, we do. And so far, we've only been burned once. So, what about disseminating NIAAA resources? Again, I'm going to go through this quickly. We launched last year the Healthcare Professional Core Resource on Alcohol. Maureen Gardner, Laura Quacco, Ray Litton as our team leaders. This online educational resource covers basics of what every healthcare professional needs to know about alcohol, including the many ways that alcohol can impact a patient's health and provide strategies for alcohol screening and interventions. It was developed by NIAAA with input from 70 contributors, including practicing physicians and clinical psychologists with busy clinicians in mind. You know, it's designed to provide the following: knowledge to fill common gaps in training about addiction, a quick validated alcohol screening and assessment tools, clarity about what constitutes heavy drinking, alcohol severity levels and recovery, and steps to reduce stigma. I would hope that each one of you would look at this. It's on our website, you can find it easily. And I would hope that you would be ambassadors to your schools, your medical centers, your communities, that this exists. It's everything you ever wanted to know about alcohol. And it should be good for everyone, but including pharmacists, you know, nurse practitioners, physicians assistants. It was aimed at primary care docs, clinical psychologists, board-certified addiction medicine specialists. Everyone should benefit from utilizing this resource. Rethinking Drinking is one of our most popular websites. It's for general audience to assess their drinking habits and find ways to make a change. College Aim provides comprehensive information on prevention approaches found to be effective in college environments. If you're sending your kid to college, the administrators have this somewhere, they know about it, but you can check it, ask them whether they're utilizing anything from College Aim. I would if I was sending my progeny to college at this time. The Alcohol Treatment Navigator helps individuals understand treatment options and search for nearby treatment, including telehealth services. It also includes a portal to assist healthcare providers in making referrals to their patients. It tells you what is the scope of an alcohol use disorder, but also what is the scope of treatments for an alcohol use disorder. It's not just 28-day rehabilitation and AA. I'm very proud to tell you we publish our own journal at NIAAA, and has an impact factor of 7.7. This is published now. It's called Alcohol Research and Current Reviews. It's published on a continuous rolling basis. It covers a wide variety of research topic and disciplines through invited reviews. Many of you participated. You know, it's a great resource, so I hope you use it. And then Elizabeth Powell asked me to introduce this slide to you. It's called the NIH STRIDES Initiative, Science and Technology Research Infrastructure for Discovery, Experimentation and Sustainability. Aims to reduce economic and process barriers to using cloud services for NIH-funded researchers and promote data access across NIH and NIH-funded institutions. Provides consultation and technical support, training and certification, discounts and favorable pricing on services from Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud Platform, and Microsoft Azure. The NIAAA Data Archive that you clinical researchers use is supported by the STRIDES Initiative. So check it out. Elizabeth, I hope you're pleased that I actually showed your slide, because you know it's very important. The new strategic plan is underway. We plan to release this later this year. This is being led by Dr. Bridget Williams-Simmons, who is our Director of Science Policy and Assistant Director for Research at NIAAA. Our research goals are elucidate the biological mechanism and consequences of alcohol consumption, identify patterns, trends, and public health impact of alcohol misuse, prevent and reduce alcohol misuse, alcohol use disorder, and associated consequences, improve diagnosis, and expand treatment of alcohol use disorder and alcohol-related conditions. But as I mentioned, we have cross-cutting themes on diversity, equity, and inclusion, applying a life course approach to alcohol research, integrating care for alcohol-related problems, and innovate alcohol research and care through technology and data science. This is going to be new and very important. So I'd like everyone from NIAAA who is here at the meeting to please stand up. I want you to see the people that contributed to this presentation, that contributed to the work we do every day. They work very hard. Out on time for you all, so I'm sure you're happy about that. I want to give a special thanks to Laura Lenardi, Laura Manella, Devin Plug, Patricia Powell, Trish Powell, Pamela Wernick, Aaron White, and Bridget Williams-Simmons. They all worked very hard to make sure I had no errors in the slides, and I think for the first time in my life there were no typos on the slides, so thank you very much. Time for questions?
We should have about 15 minutes for questions, but before you join for questions, we have questions from our members. So I want to thank you, Dr. Koob. Thank you for all that you're doing. It's very exciting to see actionable steps, and I got a lot of actionable ideas. I hope you did too, about how we can serve as ambassadors, how we can move the science forward, because there's a gap, and that gap is being filled with non-scientific ideas, and it's up to us to really advance the scientific ones. So, Dr. Koob, we have 6 questions from our members. Thank you to all of you who submitted questions. The first one has to do with, what do you see as some opportunities for NIAAA given the recent research intersection of implementation science and mechanisms of behavior change?
Well, first of all, I just want to say we love mechanisms of behavior change, and we really think that research on mechanisms of behavioral change have been fruitful in identifying mechanisms of behavior that are engaged in many of the outcomes that we're studying. And now the challenge is to determine which are most effective in prevention, treatment, and sustaining recovery, and how to incorporate these findings into intervention strategies. I call this intervention prevention. I just want to mention that one of the things that frustrates me, and I welcome individuals working in this area to help if they think they can, is how do we scale up some of these interventions as well? When I mentioned this at a meeting some time ago, one of my colleagues called it meta-translation, but I just put the B in your ear on that issue. How do we find interventions that are not only successful, ones that are not only successful after a 5-year intense program, but what about ones that could be from that could be scaled up and used in middle school, for example? So think about it.
Thank you. Our next question, given the Biden-Harris administration's emphasis on harm reduction, how is NIAAA going to be responsive and inclusive of harm reduction approaches?
Well, first of all, as I mentioned, harm reduction is embedded in our recent definition of recovery. Also, FDA guidelines accept no heavy drinking days in clinical trials, and we're now working with the FDA to consider broadening clinical endpoints to include reductions in the WHO risk drinking levels. I want to acknowledge also Alan Marlet's work in encouraging the field to move in this direction years and years ago. And in fact, I found a quote from a psychotherapy net that was an interview with Alan in 2011. If they want to quit, we will help them do that. If they want to be able to reduce their drinking, well, we want to support them then too. And you know, I told Bob DuPont, who was giving me a hard time about why NIAAA was not doing harm reduction, I said, Bob, we've been doing harm reduction since before the cows came home. So, and I sincerely believe that we've always looked at treatment in the context of harm reduction. What you all have to convince the world is that it's not just AA and it's not just 28-day rehabilitation, both of which are necessary in some cases, but by far not the only forms of treatment.
Thank you. In what ways is NIAAA planning to support community-based participatory research in marginalized and minoritized populations?
So we're working on a concept led by Deidre Roach, Dr. Deidre Roach at NIAAA, called the Model Continuums of Care Initiative to Advance Health Equity Among Women and Girls in Racial, Ethnic, Minority, and Other Marginalized Communities. This concept is envisioned as a trans NIH research program that would apply the latest implementation and dissemination science approaches to significantly reduce the prevalence and impact of multi-morbidity among historically marginalized women of reproductive age who are at risk and living with mental health disorders, substance use disorders, cardiopulmonary diseases, and common metabolic disorders such as diabetes. We've actually begun to enlist buy-in from some of the other institutes, and so this is an area we're going to launch later this year or early next year.
How does NIAAA see the brain science impacting direct patient care in the immediate future?
Well, I already mentioned the addiction neuroclinical assessment framework, and I think that's a valuable one for neurosciences. But I really want to urge neuroscience to start thinking about machine learning, computational neuroscience, artificial intelligence, meta-translation, and of course, the ever-present medications development. But I might add that there's been some pretty spectacular breakthroughs at the preclinical level recently, vis-a-vis, and early clinical part, vis-a-vis medications, some of which infect inflammation, some of which modify gut-brain interactions. So, I still think there's a lot of room for translation and utilizing the information we're learning from neuroscience for translation to the things that we've talked about today.
Our last question from the members, how do you view an ideal future regarding how patients receive care in the community?
Well, I hope you got a view today of some of the things that we think are important. I have that dream that I share with Kevin Kuntz, who founded or at least was one of the founders of the American College of Addiction Medicine, and now has a addiction medicine specialist accreditation program that's just taken off across the United States. They graduated 200 people this year, which is really fabulous. Most of whom were psychiatrists, but some were primary care docs. And that is, that we would have a SWAT team that would descend on an emergency room that would, like what you have if you had a heart attack, and they would be specialists in alcohol use disorder and addiction that could whisk you away and provide you with medicine that would help, but at the same token, maybe involve you in detox, but at the same token, engage you in long-term treatment. And I don't see why we can't do that. We actually had a big discussion about this at the College on Problems of Drug Dependence, and a number of people had really interesting ideas on how we might accomplish this using programs that currently exist in certain medical centers. And my other dream is that there would be a poster in every doctor's office in the country showing what a standard drink is. And I wonder how many of you know what a standard drink is. 5 ounces of wine, 12 ounces of beer, 1.5 ounces of distilled beverage. It's not like the New Yorker cartoon where, I only have 1 drink a day and it's a glass of wine that's the size of a liter bottle.
Thank you. I recently had my undergrads pour drinks at UCLA. They had a good time doing it, and they quickly realized what you're saying. We're going to open up for questions now. We have 5 minutes. Michael, did you want to start?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Koob. Dry January USA now has a home in Nashville, Tennessee. at Meharry Medical College, which is a historically black school. We have a registered trademark with the parent organization Alcohol Change UK. So we're really pleased about that. We do have a booth here. I'm actually the Chief Medical Officer for Dry January USA. I think a lot of our colleagues may not know there is a home for it, and it is at a historically black school. There is an app called Try Dry, and we're also going to be offering adult non-alcoholic beverages for people to try. A company called Liars is helping. I'll be providing those to you. My question to you, though, is these new adult non-alcoholic beverages are gaining rapid acceptance. The technological advances are such that they are, the experience and taste are close. What do you see as the benefits of those coming on the market, and what do you see as the risks?
So the benefits are that, you know, they provide an option for individuals in social situations if they don't want to drink. And you know, a Perrier or a sparkling water with a lime in it is another option, obviously, but they do provide an option, and that's the good news. The bad news is that a beverage like that for a person who's in recovery can be a trigger, can be a cue to bring back memories of alcohol that are going to be motivational. In other words, they have incentive salience value. So, you know, they have to be used with care.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, I want to ask about your focus on culture and diversity. So I want to study Korean American populations for drinking problems, because drinking and alcohol consumption is integral part of job functions in Korea and civilization. And then they can translate in the Americans here and the Muslims use. But problem is, you know, when we study one ethnic group, we really need to focus on their cultural values, not just like comparing a lot of groups. But reviewers can always say, come back to us, this is such a small population, you're studying one group. How can it be generalized? But in general, you know, people are different, and we need to study one group. And maybe I hope to identify some mechanism that, you know, we can test with the other ethnic groups. But so how can we get around this problem that we need to study one ethnic group in depth, but still somehow defend from reviewers that you're studying only one group?
It's a great question. I just asked that your exact question to Aaron White, who put together a study of Asian Americans who had come to the United States and how their drinking patterns changed. But I asked him, what are the drinking patterns in Korea? And so I think we do this all the time. We have studies on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in South Africa, because there was historically, I think it's changing now, but there was historically a very high concentration of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in South Africa. So I'm hoping that we also collaborate with the Fogarty Institute, and they're in the process now of recruiting a new director. But I think there's value in studying high concentrations of individual populations to compare and understand what changes in those same populations in the United States. So that's the short answer. But good question.
We are right at 9:15, so please join me in thanking Dr. Koob for all of his work. Don't forget the RSA challenge. I want to see lots of interactions and community building. Thank you for being here. Have a wonderful meeting. Focus on the science and being ambassadors for our science. Debbie is asking us to all vacate the space so it can be broken in.